Thank you, John. Robust. Okay, let's be robust. Now, I happen to know that the Oxford TC who are coming come on they hire a coach for the day, and I think there's about 30 of them coming on the coach, and they all sing jolly songs on the way down and stuff. So I imagine they're having fun somewhere, and they're probably having more fun. No, they're not having more fun than we're not. Of course they're not. But we will be prepared for them to come, and they'll have to find seats amongst you all, won't they? Now, one of the things I decided to do for this talk was to not do normal PowerPoints. You've had PowerPoints, lots of information. This is going to be something a bit different. But I don't want to get you to get too bored, and some of it's a bit heavy going, I think, what I've got to say. So if you're sort of not too interested in the talk, there's some pictures I'm showing. And so you can just sort of look at the pictures and sort of dream a bit. Let me just tell you what the pictures are, though, because they're quite interesting in a way. They were, I think there's about 930 of them in a file that Jan Lees put together when she did a multi-centre TC research trial, which was, I think it was 1999 to 2001 or something she did them. And she visited about 23 TCs around the country and took detailed pictures of all the insides of them without any people in. And I've added a few since that I've been to in different places. So there's about 30 different TCs, 900 pictures or so up here, and they're just flicking up at random. And I like to think of it, I don't know if you know that sculptor called Rachel Whitread who did the house inside, but instead of doing the house itself, she did the space of the house, and it's like a negative of the house. And I think this is like a bit like the negative of a TC. It's like sort of, this is the space without the people, and the TC really is the people. So it's a bit sort of strange experience, just seeing these empty spaces in all sorts of different places. So anyway, look at those if you get bored, and I'll test you at lunchtime, see if you've got all 30 of them. Okay? And Sarah will give you a prize for everybody who gets all of them. Thank you, Sarah. That's okay. Let's get started with the talk bit. Now, when I agreed to do this talk, my original title was a bit more strident than the one I've got at the moment. It was TCs for the Future: Adapt or Die. But because that was a bit too controversial, I changed it to what's on your programme, which is TCs for the Future and what we need to do about it. But I'm afraid to tell you, although the title on your programme is quite right, I still think that I'm going to really do the original one. And I'm going to be giving quite a stiff message about how we really have to shape up if we're going to survive much longer as we are at the moment. So when I realised that's what I'd signed myself up to, I had a sinking feeling of, oh no, how am I going to put this across to these people without falling out with everybody? And so when I look back at what I'd written, which I did over the weekend, I think I'm going to insult and sort of upset all the people who sort of believe in modernisation things in the first half, and then I'm going to upset all the people who believe in TCs in the second half. So there'll be nobody left talking to me by lunchtime. So I think I'll just sort of quietly slope away at that point. I hope not, anyway. So on one side, this is oversimplifying, but on one side, when I talk about TCs needing to change, I always get some people who say, we've sold out. I've sold out if I'm saying that. We're throwing away this precious thing that you can't mess about with. I remember in the large group at last year's Windsor conference, there was a great discussion about the fire in the belly you needed in order to sort of keep the idea of TCs alive and sort of and vibrant and sort of energetic. And I think that's true. That is what we need, and we mustn't let that be put out by all these sort of modernisation things we've got to get on with at the moment to survive. But then on the other side, there are powerful and influential people around who tell me that those of us who work in TCs, we're dinosaurs, or we're vestiges of a bygone age, or we're old hippies, or we're hopelessly romantic and we're out of touch. And I think the one to capital really is we're an evidence-free zone. Now, the last one was made to me by, in the coffee room at the old offices around the corner in Mansell Street, by Tim Kendall. Now, Tim Kendall's an influential member of the college, and I think he's just been appointed to be National Director of Mental Health for England. So maybe that's a bit worrying in some ways. Although I think the evidence thing is changing, but more of that later. So in a way, we've got the might and majesty of NHS England thinking we're not serious about evidence on one side, and then the therapeutic community, radicals and hardliners, saying we've lost the plot and we'll all go to hell in a handcart if we start sort of talking to the enemy about things like needing to change TCs. They've got to be kept the same or else. But I think we've got to try and accommodate both. And I quite like that impossible position, really, because I do believe both those points of view. I think that TCs do need to do something different from what we've always been doing, maybe as well as what we've always been doing, and that we're not very good at that. because we're so committed to preserving the, the really impressive and powerful things that we do in TCs. So I think I'm saying that we need to be more willing to change, and we need to keep some of the things we do the same. And what we need to keep the same are about some of the things that are very important to us all, I think. Things like relationships, continuity, emotional safety, not being disempowered or made to feel like you're part of a machine or an industrial sort of process. Got to be allowed to act authentically, and dare I say, at least some of the time, about having fun together. I think that's a very important part of a therapeutic community life. So where I'm hoping to get to in this talk is the idea that we sort of need to leapfrog over some of these horrible modernisation and restructuring processes to get to something better, something that is much more real and authentic and sort of human, really. Most of the so-called reforms we've all been put through in our different ways are sort of sterile and minimalist, and they cut things down to the bone. And we've got so used to them, we've forgotten that actually things can be different. Things can be creative and flourishing and imaginative, at least in the public services, where those sorts of things have been sort of squashed down by the relentless pressure to modernise. And everything really feels different in the last few years.
Just ignore
me. Are you right there, Sarah?
Yeah, just ignore me. You've lost your pictures.
Oh, we lost the picture. Oh, sorry. So you better listen to me for a minute until Sarah puts the pictures back, and then you can go to sleep again. What did it do then? It's just
gone off.
Okay, we're back. Oh, that's Lothlorien, that one, lovely place up in Scotland, yeah. Okay, so that's not just for us in the NHS or the prison service or social services. I think it's all over the place, probably all over the world really at the moment. And it's what some people call the new public management. And it's got a sort of business and management ethos that's really completely changed the nature and experience of us who are working in the public service. For example, I think people used to be very proud to work in the NHS, but now I think people still are proud, but they're more likely to feel anxious, actually, and afraid of doing something wrong. We did a national listening exercise last year with sort of Claire Gerarda and some people from the Institute of Group Analysis. And we found the predominant word people used about their experience of working in the NHS was fear. And the predominant word for what they needed but didn't get was support. And that's a sad state of affairs, really. I would say that it's because of really the crass way that a lot of the modernisation has been done in the NHS. And Mid Staffordshire, I'm sure, is an example of what goes wrong in a bad way. And I think they're probably true, those sort of pressures in other sort of economically stressed services, and particularly public services at the moment as well. But I'm proposing that in TCs we've got a different answer to that we don't need to try more and more of the same sort of modernisation treatment, get things leaner and more efficient and meaner. But instead of that, we can sort of out-modernise in a way, or even post-modernise the most sort of progressive of ideas and in our colleagues and things. We can do something different because there's something particular we're good at, and I'm going to get back to that. So I think it means we've got to change even more than we'd thought about changing or thought possible. And because of it, in the world of TCs, we've been doing loads of the right things for years, actually. I mean, like acting democratically and doing good service user involvement. And I think we could be really good at this sort of leapfrogging across that sort of barren land of sort of modernisation and stripping everything back. And I think if we do leapfrog over it and find some different way to do things, that'll be even more fun than just trying to continue doing traditional TCs in the way we've always done them, particularly in such hard times as we're in at the moment. Let me take a short digression for a minute and talk about the language we use. I don't think it is really about two sides, one of which says change everything or die, and the other says no way. It's not a battle between two opposing views, really. It's not even an argument. I think what we need to do is step back and look at what are we really trying to do in our work. If we just argue between each other, that's going to take us nowhere. So if we step back and look at the whole framework of what we're doing, I would say that the way that we look at things at the moment, the way where we are from at the moment, it's too restrictive, too focused, too concentrated on this sort of thing we call mental health, and it's too sort of directive. We're working really by going along with this. We're working to a business school sort of type agenda of what are we going to do about it, rather than a sort of therapeutic stance, which is more what on earth is going on here, and really trying to understand it. So in the world of modernisation, it's all about what we do to each other and how that's all written down in policy, and then things are made to happen by the dreaded managers. But what I'm saying is what really matters is not that, it's not what we do to each other, but how we are with each other. And I hope you sort of get the drift of that, because that's the sort of theme of what I'm saying, and I hope you'll get it by the end and see what I'm saying, that it's not a sort of adversarial position I'm taking, it's a hang on, let's look at this and understand it a bit differently. So let's start by looking at the idea of modernising, and then look at what we hold most dearly, and then think about how we do both, and what that looks like from here at the sort of Community of Communities project. I think it means holding on to the valuable bits and doing what we need to survive. And I think what we're trying to do is survive this thing that they call new public management, which I think is another of those sort of roads to hell paved with good intentions, really. So, modernising. Some call it reforming, service remodelling, various other words and phrases. Transformational change is another one I've heard a bit more recently, and I'm sure there's lots of other new management buzzwords they sort of roll out to sort of impress us with and sort of think, oh, they're really on the ball now. But it comes out sometimes in a rather more antagonistic way when people say to me, oh, you've got to get real. You know, and that's quite sort of negative, and it comes from this sort of business and economic way of thinking that things have got to get more and more efficient and focused and sort of lean and mean. I mean, I'm not arguing against thoughtful development and all the things that go with that, and that sometimes includes change and loss and the trauma that goes with that and has to go with that. That has to happen sometimes. But I am arguing against the sort of extreme and continuous and mindless change that gets imposed on us from above. I mean, ultimately, I think, by a mindless government. And it leaves the experts, and I mean by that both our service users and professional staff, feeling really disempowered by it all. And it's disempowered because it's really it seems to be only the accountants who are making the real decisions. Now, I could give many examples of the way we're all sort of slaves to the machine nowadays, from the sort of digital tyranny of IT systems, and 17 levels of permission you need to get to change a light bulb, and the sort of irrelevant training courses we all have to go on. I mean, I think better word than training is conditioning for those sorts of things we do. It's more like they have to do with rats and sort of maze and things, rather than actually this is how you must do it. It's about the compliance requirements, rather than real sort of thoughtful training. But of course, this is what happens when we live in a world that's absolutely intolerant of uncertainty and governed by thinking only about risk. We all sort of hunker down, we act defensively, and do what we can to cover our backs. There's not much room here for creativity or playfulness or joy. And in a way, perhaps that's a sort of rather chilling parallel to sort of national and international current affairs at the moment. Everything is somewhat grim in many ways. But in the clinical world, there is a way I see forward in this. If we reframe risk as something that is best managed and contained by relationships, rather than by policies and procedures and locked doors and starting from a place where you don't trust anybody, then things can look different. It's often rather difficult to do, and it can only happen if we've got the sort of time and energy left after we've met all the sort of statutory demands that are on us nowadays. And that usually means filling in something on a computer so that we're compliant with, lots of compliance matrices and, that way in which we're all sucked into the machine and made to do these things. But what we must do is we must be willing to question those demands as well. This is a TC principle. When we're told you must do this, we need to think, and like we teach members of our TCs to think, well, why must I do it? And then discuss it and understand it. Most things, when they're discussed, do become understandable. And when we know why we're doing something that seems mindless, then we might be willing to do it. Or we might want to ask some more questions. But at least we'll be talking to somebody about it and not just acting in a mechanical way like a sort of machine. Unfortunately, I think this may be a bit of an old-fashioned view nowadays, and the world sort of doesn't work like that in some ways. Conversations with human beings are often very difficult to have. It's probably because they're just too expensive. But another example that really bugs me is hospital computer systems and the notes we put on them. There are often reams and reams of these notes, and you can't find the thing you're looking for. And they're either so anodyne they're almost meaningless, or they're sort of laden with unconscious bias that they're like toxic waste there for inside somebody's clinical record, there forevermore. And I think that's a really bad thing for stigma in mental health. I think those computerized records are very worrying and troublesome in some ways. But the thing that most of these modernisation processes impose on us, I think, and these are the things I'm talking about, is dehumanization. When clinicians have to go to work and think that they just sort of have to go get through the day somehow or other and escape back home without having sort of done anything they can be blamed for, and they have that sense of fear that we picked up last year, I think we've lost the whole purpose and meaning of being a caring profession. When the only things we must do is to record everything we do rather than think about what we do, we've sort of lost the plot, really. We're working for the benefits of the organisation and its own anxieties rather than for our patients and their needs. We've lost the central importance of relationships. One of our TC members in Slough, the Embrace Group, not somebody who's here today, but one of the others, describes it very graphically as, he said, you just lose your identity as a human being and become just a number when you enter the system. The system and the modernisation machinery that goes with it just doesn't do relationships. It's got ever more complicated ways to increase efficiency and meet the challenges of financial pressure and all those sort of euphemisms, but it can't cope with messy things like the importance of staff-patient relationships, let alone team relationships, and never mind organisational relationships and the whole culture of a unit. And the experience of a patient is meant to be important nowadays, but it's also in a rather disconnected and I think a bit trivial of a way sometimes. People are meant to score with happy faces or on a computer feedback machine when they're on their way out of the building. We've all become sort of like consumers or providers in that sort of, it's like a commercial transaction, a smiley face, a neutral face, or a sad face, like you sort of put ticks on when you buy something from Amazon. Is that what we've come from? And that just doesn't feel respectful of the sort of depth of work we're trying to do. So, just to think a little bit more about relationships, whether personal, professional, family, romantic, whatever, I sometimes argue that relationships are like waves and individuals are like particles. It's much easier to think that all matter is just blobs of stuff like individuals, but that's not really what it's like. And modern physics, I think, I don't know the details of this, but I think modern physics tells us if your theory has to have a wave function as well as discrete lumps of stuff. And I think that's a very nice parallel to the sort of group view, the group analytic view particularly, that it's more about the relationships between each other. In other words, the waves that define us rather than the sort of blobs as individuals that we are. I know we all know those relationships don't obey all the sort of rules of rational processes, but I think for that they're more interesting. And I just want to turn to one of my sort of heroes, really, who's Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist. He's like the sort of high priest of sort of postmodern optimism. And he says we must value and cherish and use irrational processes. They're one of the real things that make us human. And all I'm saying is that we need to accept that relationships are often irrational and uncertain and sometimes a bit chaotic. And we have to hold on to the anxiety and contain the anxiety of that situation. What all this management and modernism tries to do is do something about it, to extinguish the anxiety, to not allow it, to be intolerant of it, and make it into a procedure. And that might be like increasing somebody's observations on a psychiatric ward, or writing a new measuring scale, or making a new regulation, rather than just reflecting and trying to understand what's going on and why, and sharing that between people. Now, I hope you think most of us are good at these other way of doing things in TCs, and I hope you think that it's important we don't lose them in wherever we happen to work. But I want to say something a bit more challenging than that, and it's keeping on the relationships theme. What we're talking about here is prioritising relationships above the written, rational and measurable aspects of all the sort of computerised stuff we have to do, that it says we have to do in our job descriptions. And actually I think most people spend at least a big chunk of them, possibly most of their working life doing. Relationships are actually the bit that should come first. Now that's a rather radical idea perhaps, but I hope you're still with me because I think it's what we actually do very well in therapeutic communities. It is about the way we are with each other rather than what we do to each other. Issues of power and coercion and inequality, they sort of fade into the background when we're having an authentic encounter with each other. Now whether that's in a community meeting, which like we had this morning, that was great, having a community meeting like that, or it could be in a supervision session, or outside the TC itself, it could be in a sort of strategy planning meeting, a co-creation meeting with service users, or in some sort of high-level committee. It's that authentic encounter. It sort of takes away the need for all those sort of procedural sort of safety guards that are put in that stultify everything. But trying to describe this sort of way we are with each other is always going to be an approximation. And we'll never get a logical or scientific definition of what this sort of quality of relationship is. lots of theories have helped us to see it. I mean, those of us who work in TCs have usually got a psychotherapy or a clinical background of some sort. Myself, my own training was in sort of group analysis, and that helped me get close to what it's all about. Many psychotherapists, it comes with sort of the idea of object relations. That's the way they understand relationships, and that's sort of from psychoanalytic theory. Others, I think, the sort of systemic views, like they have in family therapy, sort of make sense of how relationships work. And I'm sure there are many other relevant theories in other fields, but they're all about relationships. And they're all trying to convey it in a language where the words don't really do justice to it. The words aren't quite right for what it's saying about. I think probably, you know, poets and artists are doing it better than scientists, really. And I don't know if the neurobiology is sort of strong enough yet. I'm not strong enough on the neurobiology to be sure, but it's like the right brain that that's the sort of more less deliberate sort of side of thinking. It does the relationships, and the left brain does the sort of rational and logical communication about it all. But it's always communication about it, like after it's been sort of badly translated, and it's never the real thing or the real experience of those relationships. So there's a sort of fundamental impossibility here. Although there's a fundamental impossibility, I think there is in history, and I want to go into a little bit of history now, there is something about this quality of relationships that people have tried to do across the centuries, and some of them are very relevant for us in TCs, and I'll just touch on three of them, and so perhaps as examples of the sort of thing we're trying to do. So the earliest, and in a way the simplest one I'm using, is William Tuke. Now who knows who William Tuke was? Most people? Not many. Okay. William Tuke's very important. He was the Quaker who set up the retreat in York in the 1790s. And all he did really was start seeing people with mental health problems as human beings with human needs, rather than a sort of different race apart. Now, I think it was Descartes who said that people who were mentally afflicted are actually in the same category as animals, and how we relate to them. And I heard a Radio 4 program just yesterday, actually, when I was in the car, and it was about how in Bedlam, the hospital in London, the routine practice in those days was to chain people up and actually just beat them in order to stop them behaving badly. And that's unthinkable to us now, but it's what was happening then, and it's what William Tuke changed. They didn't agree with all this, and they started relating to these people as sort of fellow human beings with an entirely different, and I'm using this phrase quite a lot, quality of relationship to what had happened before. And that really started quite a sort of movement that spread across Europe and across into America, that was a different way of looking after people with mental disorders than happened before. And it became known as moral treatment. Now, moral treatment's a good phrase, although Aldo, my friend from Italy, was telling me yesterday there's actually a quirk of translation there, and it wasn't meant to be moral treatment, but I still rather like it as a way of thinking. This is a much more human, much more authentic, much better way of relating to each other. So that's the first of my three. The second is a hero of mine from undergraduate days, and most of you, I expect, will have heard of Ronnie Lang, R.D. Lang. He wrote The Divided Self, the sort of seminal book about it, his first book, which was really the best one before he went off the rails and took too much acid and got too drunk the whole time. The Divided Self, he wrote when he was about 29, I think, and it came out in 1960. But he vividly illustrates how dehumanizing medical psychiatry was in the 1950s, and how much of madness actually can be understood if you have a different sort of relationship with the person who you're seeing as mad. And he advocated being with and tolerating this madness until you could sort of start to understand it. And that had a lot of chaos and mess with it at the places he worked, like Villa 21 and Kingsley Hall. But having others able to tolerate one's madness, if you were the person who was the service user in that situation, as it were, that was a new experience, and it was a new sort of relationship for people who'd been so sort of objectified and maybe abused by biomedical psychiatry. And I think there are things like that are starting up in the last decade, actually, things like the Hearing Voices Network. And I think the better bits of the recovery movement, too, have that behind them. Although I think recovery has become something of a bandwagon. And I think it was Gary Winship here last year or the year before who made a very passionate case that sort of recovery must be... it's got some good things at its core that are the same things we have in TC, but actually it gets sort of routinized and loses the meaning of it if we're not careful. So recovery is good, but it's got to be done in the right spirit, I think. There's another one that's going on at the moment, I don't know if people have come across it, and that's the open dialogue approach. Now that comes from Lapland in Finland, and it's also based on the ideas of critical psychiatry. And they're on the same case too. They've got a very interesting rule of when they see people as a whole system and as a family, but they have a very interesting rule that nothing must be said about the patient unless they're in the room listening to it with you. So nothing is kept away from them. Now I don't know how they're going to translate it into a British concept, and how that'll get sort of boxed in and maybe spoiled somewhat by trying to run the program in this country. But there's four big mental health trusts that are actually running a formal formal randomised control trial on it. So that will be interesting to see as it comes out over the next few years. And as I say, it's from the same sort of stable, same critical psychiatry thinking going back to the days of what they call anti-psychiatry, which I don't really think was anti-psychiatry, I think it was critical psychiatry. So here's where we come in TCs. We relate to people in a way that tolerates different relationships, and through the wide range of the things we get up to together in TCs, we come to understand each other, or at least be able to live a more harmonious life amidst all the struggles and conflict that go on for us all. So I'll move on to the last of my three history examples, really, and that's Franco Bazzara. And I've just read a biography of him and what he did in Italy when he was medical superintendent of Gorizia Asylum in the 1960s. Now that was a huge old-fashioned psychiatric hospital at the northeastern corner of Italy, up past Venice, and on the Adriatic Sea, just before you get into sort of Croatia and the countries down there. And he was horrified when he moved there. I think he was moved there because he thought it was a lousy job, and he didn't really. He thought it was awful and had to do. It's sort of not entirely altruistic motives, but he wanted to do something about it because he saw the inhuman way people were treated. And this has really, to me, really clear echoes of nearly 200 years before, when Kook was at the retreat, and actually we need to treat people as humans. And it makes me feel, what have we learnt about moral treatment in the 200 years or so? We might well wonder we're sort of back where we were. But anyway, after a few years of sort of trying to do something about it, public awareness raising and political lobbying, Bazzara eventually had the Italian law changed, and that was in 1978. And that's Law 180, which is quite famous. That's Bazzara's law, it's sometimes known as, and that was to close all the institutions. Now, as I say, I know some of his motives might have been a bit, not altruistic entirely, and I'm not trying to say that what he did was a complete success, but I think it's a real and serious attempt to use the law to change that quality of relationships in the brutal and inhuman parts of what was then the Italian psychiatric system. Now, I'm sure we could have all sorts of arguments and ideas for how it could have been done better, but the point is that the problem was recognised at a level that it never had been before. And I want to also say that here we are again, maybe. We're at a similar point, here in the UK, perhaps elsewhere in the Western world. Okay, we've closed down the toxic institutions that form the framework for those horribly institutionalising relationships. But with what we call, rather blandly called, community care, we've recreated something that's rather horrible as well. Coercive, disempowering, and downright sort of paternalistic and sometimes infantilising relationships. And it's got worse and worse through our more and more desperate attempts to get efficiency, to save money, to avoid conflict, to manage risk. It's become more and more rigid and less human. Now, the old Victorian asylums were founded as a socially progressive and compassionate way to deal with madness. Many of them ended up 100 years later as a public disgrace, it's true, but they, in a way, suffered from the law of unintended consequences, if you like, and I really prefer calling it the road to hell being paved with good intentions. And it didn't go wrong because of the bricks and walls of the institutions or because of some malevolent government policy. It was because of the nature of the relationships they allowed to develop and change in them. They were strict hierarchies. More and more rigid policies were written to cope with the problems that came up, and there was nobody with enough power to question what was going wrong. And I think we're doing exactly the same thing again. When that TC member of ours from Embrace in Slough said that he was stripped of his humanity and treated like a number when he was admitted to the local mental health services, I'm sure he's not alone in that. He's saying that the modern system dehumanises people too. I mean, not as violently or perhaps as obviously or physically as the old asylum days, but in a much more subtle way. It's like, this is what's best for you. We're the experts. We have the evidence. Do as you're told, or you'll have to. and we'll section you or something like that. I mean, it's coercive and it's not. And I'm saying people lose their humanity in that process. I think you could call it couple of words I came up for it. One would be institutional paternalism, and I'll explain the difference in a sec. And the other would be biomedical hegemony. Now let me just explain those two. Institutional paternalism is about the whole system having rules that are imposed by the organisation, ostensibly for everybody's good, patient safety, blah, 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 blah. But they actually morph into a rather rigid power structure where things can't be challenged and questioned. Perhaps they can by rigid and inflexible procedures like you have for complaints and grievances, but they're administrative processes that deliberately make everything sort of sterile and procedural. They lose the relational context of them, and they don't find meaning and understanding, just sort of blame and retribution. So that's institutional paternalism. The other one I think we're deep into at the moment is biomedical hegemony, and that's more to do with the dominant paradigm or discourse which is acceptable in the field in question. Here we are in the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Hegemony is a sort of tricky word, so I think it could also, I mean, it means the dominant way of thinking sort of thing, that sort of takes over everything. So it's a bit like biological fundamentalism or biological dogmatism, biomedical dogmatism, sorry, and I think they'd mean much the same. But what it is that mental health is dominated by a view that there's a brain fault that can most efficiently be rectified by physical means. And at the moment, that's mostly drugs. But it's been all sorts of things in the past and may well be in the future. I think there's a recent paper in the American Journal about sort of deep brain stimulation and things. So I think things like that are on the cards at the moment as well. I think very few psychiatrists would actually say that these are the only things that matter, these biomedical things, but I think nowadays most have to work in this way, whether they like it or not. They've got little time or scope or support to considering anything apart from diagnosis and prescription. And as the power at the moment is lodged mostly with the medical profession, it's unlikely to change very easily. Now, along with this goes the huge dark shadow of the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm not going to go on too much about that, but all the economic and free market arguments that go with it and the enormous power that it therefore has in the system. I mean, I won't waste your time by ranting on it now, but I think many others do that better than me. But I think it's fair enough to say what I call the biomedical hegemony is very well supported by the pharmaceutical industry. And actually, whether it's administrative or psychiatric or world economic, whatever system it is that's doing it, the effect is to take responsibility away from people and leave them disempowered and in the hands of the so-called experts. And by taking that responsibility away from people, it's exactly the opposite of what we try to do in TCs. In TCs, we try to empower people and give them responsibility for themselves and for each other. And that feels profoundly against the tide in this world of new public management where everything has to be absolutely written down and accountable. There's a problem with this, though, I think, when it comes down to the level of individual freedom. I think things are, in a way, going against a tide as well. And that is that this institutional paternalism or biomedical hegemony is getting less and less acceptable in our socially networked times. It's an attitude that's more and more difficult to maintain, really, this sort of we know best attitude, when everything's information rich, everything's transparent, there's freedom of information, everything's sort of got to be accounted for. People expect now, they expect openness, and they're able to make and the ability to make real choices for themselves, and I think rightly so, and that's completely in keeping with our democratic principles of TCs. It goes wrong through the ways of relationships are made to happen in the system, often rather mechanically, led by the computer information systems, and I would say almost entirely in the service of sort of risk assessment and risk management. The fact that the core of care is about how one human being helps another human being can almost be entirely lost in that. I mean, nowadays, one of the things I noticed when I went to a hospital appointment recently is a notice on the staff that reminded staff to say, "Hello, my name is so-and-so." I mean, what sort of culture, though, have we set up? What sort of roads are hell paved with good intentions when staff need to be told to do things like that, where we have notices on the wall to remind staff that they're humans and that their patients are humans too? These things should be absolutely ordinary, but they have to have a notice on to tell people. Anyway, enough said. I think you can see what I'm saying is the problem, and I'm now going to turn to something different, which is what the viewpoint from here at Community of Communities, what we're doing about it. So, let me have a sip of water before I carry on. So, this is the second half now, probably more than halfway through now. Are you enjoying the pictures still? Oh, that's a prison one. They're a bit grim, the prison ones. Yeah. Okay. Right, let's identify first what these modernisation things are that I think we need to take seriously. And I'm going to divide them up into need-to-dos. So we need to, this is in the TC world, we need to know what we're doing and that we're doing it well. Now that's quality assurance, and it's what they specialise in here at the college, in the department upstairs. The team are doing quality assurance. The second one, we need to show that what we're doing is worth doing and that it works. And that's research. Despite that sort of tag of being called an evidence-free zone, we're not an evidence-free zone, and we've got to improve our research. Third one is we need to spread the ideas beyond TCs and join up with others. External agencies, I think, got mentioned this morning. But without being too precious about what we're doing, or we've got the only way of getting it right sort of thing. None of that should be carried on. It should be joining up in a sort of flexible, sort of sharing best ideas with people outside the TC world. And the last one I think we need to do is to give up sacred cows, and this is the only way a TC can be sort of attitude. I think that will see the end of TCs sooner than any of them if we insist we've got the only way of doing it right. So the first one, knowing what we're doing and doing it well. Now this is where we started from with Community of Communities in 2002. The method we wanted to use then was harking back to the old days, which was at the beginning of ATC in the 1970s, and that was to visit each other's TCs and pick up ideas and share what we were doing ourselves and generally feel less isolated about the way we were all working. As well as that, we incorporated the idea of standards, because that came from the college here where we set it up. We were the third network here to do it, and we could be fairly objective about that, about what those standards were with the authority of the college behind us. But the standards were democratically developed, and they used TC principles, everybody being involved in the discussion about the standards and agreeing and voting if necessary. And this meant that as TCs, we felt we owned the standards and that they were meaningful to us, not that they were some sort of persecutory orders delivered from above, as NICE and CQC and standards like that can so often feel. So it became a recognised quality improvement process, as well as being a way for TCs to not feel isolated or not knowing if they're doing it right. We were all in it together, and we could be quite comfortable with the language that we were introduced to, which you've heard quite a bit of this morning already, like sharing best practice, benchmarking, action planning. We'd done the modern thing, really, and we called it quality improvement, but we'd done it in a way that TCs could live with. And I'd maintain that just by being TCs and having this belief that the central thing is about relationships, we'd also produced something that was more meaningful than a sort of treatment manual. And we brought a bit of a Trojan horse, perhaps, here into the Royal College of Psychiatrists, into the dry and technical world of quality improvement. It's like a message of gentle subversion and quiet revolution by being TCs and standing up for TCs here in the college. I mustn't say that too loudly amongst my psychiatric colleagues, but I think we're all friends here. How many psychiatrists are there here, actually? Oh, four. Oh, not so many. Okay, so I'm safe saying things like that. Yeah, good. Okay, second one. I'm glad they've arrived, the Oxford lot, because they're. I'm going to give them a mention now, in a minute. So, the second thing that I think we need to do is we need to show that what we're doing is worth doing and that it works. And it's about research and countering the opinion that we are an evidence-free zone, as Tim Kendall called it. I'm not going into the whole RCT argument again, but I'll just summarise it by saying that many people in positions of power think that evidence is only good enough if it's type 1 evidence in that rather grandly called hierarchy of evidence that's used. And that type 1 evidence means a meta-analysis of high-quality randomised control trials. Now, I've always been deeply ambivalent about this one, because I think there are so many ethical problems and methodological difficulties in doing an RCT on therapeutic communities, as well as the sort of just the bluntness and the coarseness of the answer, which is either basically yes or no, does it people get better or not, the sort of results they give. But I'm also aware that without this sort of evidence, influential people can go on saying things like, we are an evidence-free zone. So I've come around to thinking that we need to treat it like an annoying game that we must play in order to communicate about TCs and the fact they work as a scientific fact to people like funders and commissioners and policymakers and bodies like NICE, who our existence depends on. I was on the group, the NICE group, that wrote the 2009 guidelines for borderline PD. And nice, having seen it working from the inside, it is very hard-boiled about the evidence. No shades of grey are tolerated in what they call satisfactory evidence that goes through to the summary of the guideline. In fact, the ones you see, the little thin ones, are only summaries of the evidence. The main NICE guideline is about 500 or 600 pages, and it's got all sorts of things in as well, but that never gets much of an airing because nobody's got time to read the whole thing or take much notice of it. They only read the summary of it. In fact, because there wasn't much high-quality evidence, as they call it, for borderline personality disorder, we came up with, I think, what was quite a sensible and useful guideline, and that's because it was based on a good consensus between the experts by experience, the clinicians, and the researchers who were on the panel. And not very high-quality evidence in the hierarchy of evidence, but nonetheless good, sensible things to say. Now, turning to TCs, thinking about the research of them, personally, I have no doubt that people benefit from time in TCs, which means I couldn't have equipoise if I was involved in a research effort. Because when people are immersed in that different quality of relationship, things change. We just have to talk to people. We just heard a load of people this morning talking about it in the community meeting. And I wasn't confident at all that RCTs and standardised questionnaires will really pick up that thing that's made a difference to people in a meaningful way. And I'm still not, in a way, but maybe that's because I'm expecting more of the sort of evidence-based research methods than they can really be expected of them. And I'm sort of saying I'm not playing the game, but I think we do have to play the game. So a few years ago, I was worried about what was happen when this 2009 guideline was revised. All the other sort of what I call the alpha spaghetti therapies, CBT, MBT, DBT, IPT, all those range of different sort of therapies with a manual and a sort of treatment method and a nice sort of product to sell. I thought they'd all got their acts together and then they'd have done an RCT and they get in the next guideline, and TCs wouldn't be amongst them at all, and so we'd be left out in the cold. But I have come round to realising that you do need to play the game, this evidence-based treatment game, if we are going to have any chance of surviving. Now, actually, I'm less worried about TCs being left out, and I think it was probably right to have been worried about that before. So let me tell you about some of the things that have happened recently. And this is back to the Oxford team, of course. For the last few years, I've sort of been watching from a safe distance, about 35 miles away, down in Berkshire, while Steve Pearce, my colleague in Oxford, recently chair of these standards. Give us a wave, Steve. Yeah, here's Steve. He's been running he's been learning all these rules of the evidence game, and he's been running the first ever randomised control trial for democratic TCs. He's been learning some of those rules from somebody else we know well here, who's Mike Crawford, who, as well as being a professor of mental health research at Imperial College, a young professor in his time, he's also the director of the Centre for Quality Improvement here, which hosts the Community of Communities project. And he's a consultant psychiatrist, actually, to a personality disorder unit in London, which was the first unit to have the Enabling Environments Award. So we're amongst friends, in a sense, on the research side. It's quite amused me, actually, to hear some of the how complicated and rarefied some of those rules get for the research game, the sort of statistics you use and the boxes you must tick to be considered for a good journal. Also, who can be authors of a journal and what order a paper in a journal and what order they've got to go into, and how the structures of the tables and the paragraphs has to be exactly so. And that sort of weird and arcane way that academics have to sort of preen themselves and show how big their impact factor is, as well as how, on the negative side of it, how they suffer sort of horrible and career-threatening anxiety about the regular sort of research excellence framework audit. I mean, that's another aspect, I'd say, of the new public management sort of bearing down and making people's lives a misery. But I think that sort of research would drive me bananas, but I'm glad somebody else is doing it in a way. But it reminds me also how we need the counterpoint of people like Nick Manning, sociologist who's been involved in therapeutic communities on and off throughout his career, and he asks difficult questions about what he calls the politics of data, and really where the real power is and about how funding decisions are made. But anyway, lucky for us, without any sort of institutional funding, Steve has learned the rules and played this game, and we're expecting his sort of generally positive results of the RCT on democratic TCs to be published in the next little while, next few weeks or months. But that doesn't mean I want to let you all off the hook. We mustn't think that we can now get away with not needing to do any data collection or research because the Oxford TC has shown us, they've done it all for us. And that's not true at all. And there's at least two reasons that's not true. The first is that there need to be more trials in the next few years to back up the first one. Results have to be replicated and ultimately meta-analysed, so just one is not enough. And the second one applies to absolutely all TCs. Unless you can justify the existence of your TC to your local commissioners, the managers and the referrers in hardline objective and numerical terms, you are on thin ice. And that means collecting and analysing and communicating outcome data, at least as service evaluation, if not as formal research, perhaps like an annual report for your commissioners to go along with an annual report from the community of communities. But I was rather worried a couple of weeks ago. I came here, Francesca mentioned it just now about the pod training meeting they had. I came along here, it was a Friday 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I was quite alarmed because it's a free benefit for community of communities members and hardly any TCs have signed up to it. It's very sophisticated, it's user-friendly, and it could save everybody lots of work of sort of collecting and scoring questionnaires. And I'd have thought that we were all using it. But sadly, the fact that hardly anybody is using it, I mean, we're hopefully going to be starting it soon, I think it says something about how reluctant TCs are to take on new things, even ones that make our lives easier and that help us ensure our survival and are completely congruent with TC philosophy. And that's really the sting in the original title's tail. We have to adapt to do these sorts of things, or I think we will die if we want to keep that exact model of TCs. But I'm going beyond that now. Now this is the third of my 4 need tos, and this is spreading the ideas beyond TCs. We need to spread the ideas of TCs beyond TCs themselves. And I remember when we started the Community of Communities project in the 2002 or so, John Cox, who was then president of this college, he said something to me like, it's all very well, this Community of Communities Rex, but it's such a minuscule number of services and it's too inward looking. So that was sort of in the back of my mind, that sort of criticism from him, and in the back of the team's minds, I think, when we went through the first few years of Community of Communities, with when we had a good, the membership now is just a bit under 100, and it has been pretty much over the whole time. But about a few years into the project, perhaps 2007, 2008, we started to look in earnest at what have become our core standards, which are the sort of special things that we as TCs all do, and not many other sorts of services do. And they're still the central part of the annual Community of Communities process and the TC accreditation. We also developed, with the Association of Therapeutic Communities, what we called the core values. That was just when ATC was merging with Charterhouse Group to change into TCTCs. And these were the values, these core values, they were the values that underlay the core standards. You didn't have to be a TC to have those values, but all TCs did have them, and many other places that looked and felt and smelt like therapeutic environments did too. And that was the starting point for the Enabling Environments project, which is now an award here and the same sort of stable as Community of Communities. And it's very successful. It's got nearly 200 units signed up for it now, and it's been spectacularly successful in the criminal justice world, where staff in prisons and probation hostels, from the ones I've talked to about it, they seem to be finding a new sort of purpose in their jobs almost. There's much less violence on prison wings. I think we're expecting offending rates to be reduced when people have been through the whole Pipes and Enabling Environments programme. And I think the morale of both prisoners and staff is quite a lot higher in the prisons and probation offices that use these enabling environments type standards that we've set up. And because of its success, we had on this very platform here in January, we had Michael Spur, who's the head of the UK, I think he's probably head of NOMS actually, National Offender Management Service, and he was standing here at an Enabling Environments conference saying that all prisons should be enabling environments. And then there were other people here too, including myself and Simon Wesley, the current president of the college, and Sue Bailey is edited at a different time. She's leader of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, and she said, well, this is going so well in prisons, why can't we be doing something similar in the NHS? And I wonder about that. I mean, we're trying, and we've got ideas on it. We're working on it. It might take a little while, but there does feel to be a fundamental resistance to that sort of process in the NHS. I mean, it's very hard-headed when it comes to spending money on what some people see as sort of fluffy new initiatives. It wants things like randomised control trials and NICE approval before they'll implement things. But we're hoping to get something started using the evidence from the prisons and probation side before too long. But I think that's the sort of that's a real example of using TC ideas in other settings and hopefully being able to sort of improve the quality of relationships in different settings through it. So going back to what I was saying before, it's a way of sneaking a subversive idea, really, this idea that relationships can contain risk, sneaking it under the radar, and hopefully help to sort of change the culture in places. It's done it in prison wings, perhaps we can do it elsewhere. And if we can, introduce a bit of relational thinking and compassion into, I think it was quite a brutal and hard-edged world in sort of prisons and probation hostels, surely we can do something useful in the health service too. So that's our next ambition, as it were, for enabling environments which grew out of the community of communities here. Okay, my last section is the last what we need to do section, and that's throwing away the sacred cows. And I must say I was a bit hurt when John Cox told me we were too inward-looking. We were doing our best to get TCs meeting each other and doing the review process you've heard about this morning, and to accept scrutiny of themselves by the community of communities process. And it all seemed like pretty hard work for everybody doing it. But actually, John was right. If we'd stopped there and just accepted that TCs always had to be as they always had been, because we as a group said that's the only way to do it, I think we would be extinct by now. But it's because we've taken on different things and thought more widely than that we're not extinct. And it's partly from thinking internally and doing things differently, but it's also from external pressures, which includes closing things and making commissioning more uncomfortable for us. We've lost the total immersion residential TCs that we used to have in the NHS, the residential units like the Henderson, and which closed down completely a few years ago, and Francis Dixon Lodge used to be residential. It's now a 3-day-a-week unit. But there are also, as well as the closures and the shrinking down, there are new types growing up outside the NHS and inside the NHS, which are trying out new ideas in therapeutic communities. And I think that's how it should be, really. There should be a few of the traditional day TCs. There should be a small number of residential ones, and there should be a range of different things developing alongside as well. Sort of containment with a democratic therapy program of some sort or other, maybe not actually called TCs. And that's very different from the old expectation of the old sort of monolithic TCs, as it were, that anybody who might benefit could be referred, but then they'd only select the most suitable. That's quite excluding of many people, and I think we've got to work harder to include people rather than to draw up tight exclusion criteria. In parallel to that, the non-residential NHS TCs have sort of reduced the dose over the last few years. I mean, they used to be all 5 days a week, and it's gone down to 3 days a week, and 1 day a week for some of them, and some even less. What we're up to in Slough, that our Embrace group, is a more extreme version of that progression in a sense. We only meet together for 2.5 hours a week, but we join it up with all sorts of other things people can do to make a sort of pick and mix therapeutic program. And we've got an interesting tussle amongst ourselves about what we actually call it. I say it's a micro TC because it only lasts for 2.5 hours a week, but Jeff, our head of mental health here, says it's more like a macro TC. It's like TC where the walls have been dissolved and it involves bits and pieces across the whole town. But anyway, that's one of the new ideas around for doing TC. Come to our workshop this afternoon. We're doing it twice this afternoon if you want to hear more about it. But I also think this postmodern TC development it comes out in other ideas. We've heard from people from Christchurch Deal here at the moment. The TC in Kent that's sort of based on a church. You don't have to be religious to go to it particularly, but it's based on a sort of open church there. And that doesn't even have buildings or staff. What really seems to matter, though, is the TC in the head. And that means experiencing the sort of relationships around you that make you feel safe enough to be able to do the work you need, even if you're not there the whole time and the relationships aren't always with the same people. So I think one of the ways for the future of TCs is to better recognise this TC in the head and perhaps to plan relationships with other external agencies in a local area or in some other way, but not just keep isolated and sort of hunkered down and away from everybody else, but mix in with them and join up in different ways. Something else that's been referred to this morning already, I can't remember where it was exactly. Yes, it was in one of the reports, I think, is the children's TCs. In days gone by, in the times of Finchdom Manor and Pepperharrow in the middle of the 20th century, there used to be large groups living together in grand houses, and they had great facilities and intensive TC programs, and all the sort of dynamics of the fiery and exciting dynamics that sort of group living brings. Now there's only a few of those left. And long may they survive. They do need some of them, and I'm sure we do. That there's a sort of valid need for them, but not perhaps so many. But what's happening at the moment is most TCs for children are now small TCs, and they're sort of domestic scale houses for a small group of children using TC principles. The therapeutic philosophy is the same. It's sort of democratic and as much responsibility as possible, and the sorts of relationships I keep bashing on about. But they're not TCs as we traditionally think of them. And this sector is important politically because the need for more therapeutic care for children living in institutions is well recognised by local authorities, and it's probably going to be recognised formally in the commissioning framework quite shortly. I mean, John will be able to give you more details about that, but what I hear is that's going to be something that's being thought about seriously at a high level. And as we all know, there's often items in the news about really sort of serious and horrible failures for care of children in institutional settings, where for people whose children whose parents can't do it. And I think we in therapeutic communities are in the best position to come up with models of good practice to cope with that. But to say that these places for children have to be proper TCs with all the standards for bigger TCs being met, I think that might well be shooting ourselves in the foot. So as you've heard this morning, the Community of Communities team is working on a new sort of subsection of Community of Communities called something like Therapeutic Childcare, and that will go through the same process of membership of the network and self-review and peer review, and may eventually lead to accreditation. But it's not quite TCs as we know it, and that's sort of that flexibility and willingness to change is, I think, what we here at CFC have to demonstrate that we can do in order to meet the requirements, especially when they're requirements that are politically have political weight behind them and are seen as important public things to be doing. They won't look like TCs as we knew them 50 years ago, and they may not be called therapeutic communities. But that I think is something we've got to get used to. I mean, TCs, what's the Star Trek thing? TCs as we know it, but not as we know it. Anyway, I don't know. But maybe called something quite different. So that's the end of my needs to. I'm just going to, I've got a few words of sort of closing paragraphs now. How am I doing for time? Oh, we're at time, so we'll only have one question or two. Excellent. And we can all talk over that. Let me just finish with a couple of paragraphs here for the very end. I think I started a bit late, so I didn't think it was that long, actually. I thought it was 40 minutes, but God, I've been going on a bit, haven't I? You still enjoying the photos? That's India. That's, I don't know what that is. Right. Okay. I was thinking of calling this talk, before I chose the other title, "The TC is Dead, Long Live the TC," but maybe that's too harsh as well. Because I think the TC, as we have always known it, it isn't dead, but it's got to morph and change into other things. In the same way as a small number of sort of fully immersive wraparound TCs are necessary for some people, I think the traditional tile TCs are needed in some places. So please don't take away that I'm saying TCs must change out of, all TCs must change out of all recognition. But looking at how hard it is to survive at the moment in face of this sort of risk-obsessed word and continuous financial cuts, being a real TC is a very hard job. And it's not one for the faint-hearted or those who aren't willing to sort of pay the survival game and all that evidence stuff I've described. So good luck to you, those of who are on that path, and I hope we can help you in communities stick on that path. But remember things like POD and the need to do evidence and research and the need to sort of justify yourself out and making links as well. What it means for many other services who aren't able or aren't willing to play that sort of hard game and working in a way that's essentially sort of relationship-based and not really incongruous with all the sort of risk assessment stuff. There will be a range of different things that I think will all follow the underlying philosophy of therapeutic communities. Some of them might be quite close to TCs as we know them at the moment, but a lot of them will look very different. And some of them will look like nothing we've ever seen yet. And I think that's quite an exciting prospect. But they'll all need to have that quality of relationships at their core. And that probably means some variety of sort of enabling environments type thing, even if they don't do it by the book or sign up to the award. But I'm confident that good and acceptable services in the future will certainly have a different way for people to be with each other that you find in good places anyway now. But very often in mainstream mental health or prison or children's or addiction services, there aren't those sort of good relationships. Things are stilted and difficult and not therapeutic environments. But I think that's going to have to change. I don't think people will put up with being treated so badly for much longer. A lot of people know there's sort of trouble at the mill at the moment in mental health. You know, these national calls for parity of esteem, to the growing power of the service user movement, to the sorts of scandals they expose in sort of secretly filmed panorama programs. And I come back to the point that we've forgotten how to treat each other as human beings. When our world of mental health services gets all industrialised like this and sort of corporate and institutionalised, we're not numbers or robots or badly functioning machines. We're people who are all actually interdependent on each other, and we all need each other, and not just sort of economic units. And I think this is getting increasingly recognised. A lot of people know this, but what they don't know out there is that the centuries-old tradition of therapeutic communities has some of the answers to these problems. And I think we need to go out there and tell them. And that's the end.